Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. Understanding America's history is an important part of every school child's education. But are we distorting the facts? Are we leaving children without heroes? To find out, Policy Watch is joined again by Lynne Cheney, wife of Vice President Richard Cheney, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and the author of children's books on the nation's founding, including America, a Patriotic Primer, and A is for Abigail, an Almanac of Amazing American Women. Now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Welcome to Policy Watch, brought to you from the University of Maryland and the School of Public Affairs. I'm Doug Besheroff, and my guest is Lynne Cheney, wife of the Vice President of the United States, and in her own right, an accomplished scholar and public figure. In this segment, I'd like to discuss your thoughts, Lynne, about understanding history and then teaching about it. So welcome back to Policy Watch.
Thank you.
Before your husband was elected vice president, you frequently battled against, and let me underline the word, the excesses of political correctness and multiculturalism. And yet your books, America and A is for Abigail, are studded with people of different hues and actually political orientations. And I found this quote. One reviewer described your book as, at least the book was reviewed. My books don't always get reviewed, so this is, he said it was Norman Rockwell meets Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition.
That's a nice description. I like that.
So have you had a change of heart?
Oh, no. It's, all perfectly consistent. I think what sometimes happens when we set out to tell the American story is that we tell it in a fashion that's a lot darker, a lot more negative than it deserves to be told. We teach it as a series of problems instead of as a series of challenges overcome. And I think we especially did that in the early 90s, when culture conflict was a very central part of questions about how we should teach. I think we've really arrived at a kind of national narrative that a lot of people could agree on, people from across the political spectrum, which is basically this, that we're a country founded on high ideals and great ideas, and that our children should know about the founders of the country and those ideas and ideals. But they also need to know about the men and women who have called us to task from time to time. People like Frederick Douglass, who pointed out the horrors of slavery and made us understand that we had not done a good job of living up to our founding ideals. Or people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who made it clear that by excluding women from society in so many ways. I mean, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived, women couldn't own property once they were married. It's just astonishing to think of that. That people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton reminded us that we weren't doing a good job of living up to our founding ideals and made us a better country. So that through these challenges and through the ways that we have worked to overcome them, sometimes with a lot of acrimony and difficulty, but nevertheless we have moved forward. We have become a better and better country. And I think that's a narrative that lots of people can agree on. We are a country that has a country that has progressed in terms of living up to the idea of equality, especially.
And you feel strongly about that. I'm just pulling you out here. Telling that story in terms of people.
Oh,
because
yes,
people
it's so interesting. One of the mistakes we make when we teach history is to forget the story, to just teach names and dates and places. Maybe, give a little snippet, but you need to flesh the story out so that people know about Frederick Douglass growing up not so far from here. one of his owners, he was enslaved, one of his owners, a kind woman, taught him his letters. But when her husband found out, he said, "You can't teach that boy to read. It will unfit him for slavery." And so Frederick decided to finish the job himself, and he went out on the streets and he made friends with white children and he turned them into teachers. He bought himself a copy of the Columbian Orator, saved 50 cents, which must have taken him forever, so that he could read the great speeches of the ages. By the time he escaped north, he was a man who could capture hearts, a man who could win minds in terms of how evil this institution of slavery was and how we needed to change. Well, you tell little kids this story, they love it. They understand suddenly why it is that history is not only interesting, but important. So the stories and the human stories are the key, I think, to making history attractive.
And that gives young people role models? Heroes?
Yeah, I know it sort of sounds like a sociological word, but yeah, heroes. I like heroes better. One of the other things I think we've done that's a mistake is find fault with people. And we say, George Washington owned slaves. We can't have him be a hero. Or perhaps Ben Franklin's personal life was not all we would want it to be, and so we can't have him be a hero. Well, I think that what kids understand and what they respond to is saying, heroes are mortals. They're just like you and me. But despite the fact that they were flawed, and despite the fact that they did not always live perfect lives, they achieved extraordinary things, and we should look up to them for that.
Let me pick up one theme on that. It's not just that they didn't live perfect lives and maybe they did something on the side with money or women or whatever, but the biggest complaint about many of our leaders, not just the founders but afterwards, was their attitudes about race. You mentioned Washington having slaves, but of course he freed his slaves when he died. Jefferson had slaves.
And did not.
Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner, actually, was responsible for the resegregation of the federal government workforce. And in fact, there's a controversy now about keeping his image on what is called the Woodrow Wilson Bridge here in Washington because of that. Do we have room in our political pantheon to have these? Now, forget about the fact that Wilson was a Democrat and so forth.
I'm actually not a Wilson expert, so I'm having trouble. But I think it would be a great debate to have. What were Wilson's contributions? Were they world-altering? I mean, you can't think of a Washington or a Jefferson without saying they changed the world. Madison, he changed the world. And if people have done something so extraordinary, then I think that we have to recognize that they're human and we're flawed and have fault. We did make a mistake when I was growing up in terms of having most of the heroes be white males. I actually have gone back and looked. I can't remember exactly what history textbooks I used, but I found ones that I could have used. And they did teach a little bit about Clara Barton, and there was usually something about Washington Carver.
Mm-hmm.
There was usually...
Peanuts.
Yes, there was usually something about Ralph Bunche. There was usually something about Pocahontas, Sacagawea. But you really didn't get the full flavor of how women and how people from continents all around the globe have contributed to our culture. And we need to point out that heroes come in many varieties.
Well, that reminds me of something you said a moment ago, but why don't we kind of put a very fine point on it. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. The first version, or the initial version of the U.S. Constitution, seemed to be focusing on white men as well, although a mutual colleague of ours has written a pamphlet, right, about why there are no mention of women, blacks, and Jews in the Constitution. But how should we interpret the phrase and the meaning that they had of all men are created equal, and then how does that guide our nation?
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for one, couldn't stand the idea of saying all men are created equal. And one of the most important documents in women's history is the 1848 Declaration of Women's Rights that a group gathered in Seneca Falls, New York. And they changed it, to all men and women are created equal. They simply couldn't bear it. I think if you do go back, you find that the word man was used as a placeholder for humanity. We've now come to different times when a lot of us don't feel comfortable with that. But I don't think it was meant then as an exclusion of women. However, I think it's a good thing to be sure that little kids understand that, it's all men and women are created equal.
You're talking about trying to create, let's call it an accurate image of American history and all history, warts and all. Mm-hmm. And yet, the media, and especially Hollywood movies, often tell a pretty distorted version, and I'm thinking about JFK, Oliver Stone's, maybe I should just say all of Oliver Stone's movies, but I don't know them all. And you don't have to talk about his, I realize you're a political person. But how do we win this fight against Hollywood's images, the strong images that are in our media about history, which seem to be not connected with scholarly understanding, at least?
With my grandchildren, whenever we read books, I always bring up these questions. How did the person who wrote this book know this? Has this person given us an indication of how we know this? Every once in a while you can find a mistake in a child's book. And this is a very teachable moment. Look, here's this mistake. You can't believe everything that's written. I think it's very useful, particularly in the age of the internet, to build a kind of critical analysis, critical analytical facility into kids from the earliest ages on. Just because it's written, just because it's an image, doesn't mean it's true. And each of us, as we proceed through our books and through the films we watch, needs to have that distance, that questioning, saying, is this true? And how would so-and-so know if it were true?
Now, I also wanted to mention your other book, A is for Abigail.
This has a special place in my heart. I love this book.
Because?
Well, it's made so many people think about the contributions of women to American history. If you know that if you go on Amazon and look for the reviews of any book, it's like a little war usually. There are the people who can't stand the book, and there are people who love the book. You either get 1 star or 5 stars, particularly if you're a public figure. But everyone seems to like this book, and that's very gratifying to have made that kind of impact. It also, can I tell a personal story?
Please.
I need to look at the book. Okay. This was a fun book to do for many reasons, but I'll just show you one story. It's under I. I is for Laura Ingalls, and Other Girls of America's Past is the I page. And on this page I have, the point of this page was to tell kids that history isn't just about grown-ups, that children are part of history too. And so there's Maria Weems on this page, who was a teenager, escaped from slavery and fled north. Sybil Luddington, who did what Paul Revere did about the same time he did it, though you didn't hear of her much until recently. She warned American patriots that the British were coming. But then up here is the story of a little girl named Fanny Peck, who in 1852 walked the Mormon Trail, mostly barefoot. And the reason Fanny walked the Mormon Trail mostly barefoot is that she saved her shoes for the Sabbath. She wanted to look nice when the train stopped and they stopped to worship. However, by the time she'd walked all week, on Sunday she couldn't get her shoes on. So it's a kind of endearing little story. But Fanny Peck, in fact, is my great-great-great-grandmother. And so it was wonderful to be able to put that kind of detail in here, too, to tell little girls and little boys, heroes can be elevated people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, or they can be people very close to you and people who have family stories that you should know.
Well, it's instilling young people with a desire or an eagerness to reach out. I think at one point you talked about a school teacher who encourages her students to jump for the stars.
Oh, that's Zora Neale Hurston, who was a novelist of the Harlem Renaissance. Their Eyes Were Watching God is her most famous novel. But when she tried to account for what her mother had done to make her and her brothers and sisters want to work hard and achieve much, she said that her mother used to tell her children to jump for the sun.
It's beautiful. Beautiful.
It is.
Now it's time for me to ask some of the questions from the audience, and unless we change your schedule, we're not going to get through all of these, but I'll do my best. I have a question from Justin Butters from Odenton, Maryland.
They aren't even anonymous. This is good.
Well, people were free to keep them anonymous, but there's a name here. He writes, I have daughters that have your book and enjoy it. Oh, that's
very nice.
And now it says book and not books, but we'll remedy that quickly enough. What other 3 books, not 2, 3 books, would you recommend for young girls?
Well, I'm not sure I would recommend books just about girls. There's a wonderful story about a girl who came over to the United States in the early 20th century. She came from Russia, or part of Poland, I think, that was then part of Russia. And when she got here, it's the immigrant experience, you know, she became a famous writer. And she was writing about her childhood, and she remembered the day she had learned about George Washington, and how happy it had made her to learn about George Washington. She said, I was walking home from school, and I said to myself, here's George Washington. He was like a king in greatness, and he and I are fellow citizens. So, you know, read biography. My children used to love a series called Meet Abraham Lincoln, you know, Meet Thomas Jefferson, Meet Amelia Earhart. I would recommend biography as a genre. I would also recommend tall tales, stories that, you know, expand your imagination. History is my passion, but there are all sorts of great things for kids to read. They should know about Paul Bunyan. There's some wonderful stories there. And then, you know, A is for Abigail is just full of the women that kids should know about. And it's a suggestion, a whole list of biographies they might read.
You mentioned George Washington, and your next book is about George Washington. But I have a slightly different question before I ask you about that book. One of the reasons Abigail Adams is so famous is because her letters to her husband and his letters back to her were preserved. And I know in your study of George Washington, you've read about Martha Washington. So I'd actually like to ask you about Martha, because for the audience, if they don't know, Martha burned all their letters. Right. And so we don't have the private Martha, let alone the private George. I wonder if you've thought at all about what kind of woman she was and why we don't know more about her.
There's a new biography of her, and I'm sorry I can't think of the author because it's very interesting to follow her. As, you know, she went to where Washington was. She'd travel there. Without her, Washington, I'm sure, would not have been president because, first of all, she brought wealth so that he could afford, for example, to be the commander of the Continental Army and not take pay, to spend the time away from his plantation, and they would be able to afford to keep things going. The thing about Martha is, when you look at pictures of her, she doesn't seem attractive. And I think that she's one of those people who had the bad luck to have 1 or 2 bad portraits, and that's all we remember, and so, you know, we just don't want to know much more about her. But it's a very interesting life. The letters, though. When I was writing Abigail, I read all the letters, and, you know, it's volumes of letters. It is a remarkable historic record to think that Abigail Adams was doing that, you know, keeping track of history for us, at the same time that she was running the farm. She was acquiring property. She couldn't do it in her own name, but she figured out ways to do it while John was off creating the country. She was raising her children, making sure her daughters went to school, even though that was not thought to be very important. And threatening revolution if John didn't remember the ladies. So, you know, she was the first woman, really, to complain. Women not only weren't supposed to own property, they'd not go to college, not go to school probably, not participate in athletic events, not vote. They weren't supposed to complain. And Abigail complained, and a good thing, too.
Do you think you could give us a little bit of a peek at what the George Washington book is going to be like?
Oh, the next book, the next children's book I have coming out is called When Washington Crossed the Delaware, a wintertime story for young patriots. There was this remarkable 10-day campaign that began on Christmas night when we were losing the Revolutionary War. The British had driven us out of New York, all the way across New Jersey. By the time Washington got across the Delaware River, his troops, never well equipped to begin with, were most of them without shoes. Nobody had a full uniform. They were lucky if they had a coat, and it was very cold. Washington did the most astonishing thing. He decided to go on the offensive. And just think about it. They were just down in the biggest hole you can imagine, and he decided to cross the Delaware and attack the Hessians. It's such an amazing story. There were 3 groups that tried to cross the Delaware that night, 3 columns that he meant to send across. His was the only one who made it, the only column that made it. And they then, this amazing defeat of the Hessians. Crossing the river is just such a story. They defeated the Hessians, lost very few men themselves. Washington, instead of saying, okay, that's it, we've shown we can win, said, no, we're going to attack again. And by the time he had won the Battle of Princeton, 10 days, January 10th encompasses these events, he had changed the course of history. And he had done it with a few thousand men. And when you think of war today, it's hundreds of thousands. He crossed the Delaware with 2,400 men and absolutely reversed the course of history. He gave the whole nation hope. It's such a wonderful story because Christmas, Hanukkah, everyone's thinking about presents, little kids are. He gave the nation the biggest present you can imagine, the gift of hope. So it's a story I've told my grandchildren often and around December, and so I want to tell other children too.
That's great. My memory of reading about George Washington is he was a self-improvement man. He had his lists. He decided what kind of person he was going to try to be, and he spent his entire life trying to be like that. That's quite different from our self-actualizing culture of today. I won't ask you to talk about today's culture, but if you could talk a little bit more about George Washington and what kind of role model he might provide for us.
He was very, very dignified. I think what he provides is a role model for leadership. You know, this innate dignity that everyone responded to. There's this one wonderful scene in the 10-day campaign when the American troops were lined up along one side of a creek called Assunpink Creek outside of Trenton. And the British are coming down from Princeton and in great numbers and with Hessians. And the Hessians were terrifying. They wore these great tall hats and strange uniforms, and they struck terror into the hearts of everyone who saw them. So they're all coming down from Trenton, or from Princeton, and they're on the other side of the Assunpink. Washington sent people across the creek to slow them down, you know, to keep them from arriving as soon as they could, because he didn't, for reasons that will be revealed in the book, he didn't want to have the battle that day. And so he sent these troops to slow them down. Well, the British are very powerful. They're coming very fast. And pretty soon the people who have been sent to slow them down have to rush back across this narrow bridge that goes over the Assunpink. And there's a wonderful story by a man named Private John Howland. If you get into the original documents, it's just so fascinating. He reports that Washington, on his great white horse, was waiting at the end of the bridge, and that there was such a crowd going across the bridge that when he got near Washington, he said, "I touched the shoulder of the general's horse and put my hand on his boot." And when he wrote this, 60 years later, he still remembered that day when he touched the general's horse, put his hand on his boot, and he said, "The horse and the rider both stood firm." What Washington did was just give this confidence to the people who were following him. And he was personally brave, and he made them brave as well.
2 horses shot out from under him, I think, during the French and Indian Wars.
And in one of the battles, 3 bullets through different parts of his clothing. At the Battle of Princeton, he rallied his troops and led them to within 30 yards of the British line. So imagine, you've got the Americans lined up here, the British lined up here, and Washington's right in the middle. One of his aides pulled his hat down over his face because he didn't want to see Washington killed when both sides fired. And so he pulled his hat down, he raised it up. As the smoke cleared, Washington was still there. I have read scholars criticize him for being foolhardy. So, and you could, you can see, you might make a case for that. This is, but it gave such confidence to the men who were following him.
I think one can't read about him and what he did and the way he decided how the presidency would be operated.
Well, and the fact that he quit after 8 years. He would not be king.
Let me thank you very much, Lynne Cheney, for being at the University of Maryland and being with us at Policy Watch. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Bescheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation.
We are PBS.